Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Suchandra Ghosh, Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Our subject is Indian culture and the paper is Indian epigraphy. I will be discussing with you today the module on Junagadh inscription of Rudradaman. Now, before we begin the inscription, let us first underline that with the downfall and the disintegration of the Mauryan Empire, the political map of the subcontinent was dotted with many new ruling dynasties. These dynasties were contesting with each other and proclaiming their superiority through the mode of inscriptions. Most of the early Prashustis were written on rocks, stone tablets or pillars. Now, Prashustis are actually panegyrics which are avowedly political texts. So, irrespective of their poetic embellishments and exaggerations typical of these Prashustis, these also provide us with kernel of political information, regional formation and expansion of a ruler's territory. So, it is possible for us to garner information when we study a Prashusti, particularly on the political history and also on some other aspects of history. So, Prashustis are a very important genre of epigraphy. Now, Prashustis were written mainly in the courtly milieu of the post-Mauryan period. Early Prashustis were composed in a period when the category of Prashustis were fluid and the format was not fully developed. In the later period, we find that there was a format of classic Prashustis, but in the early historical period, each of the Prashustis were different with their own nuances, but sometimes we find that there was a shared tradition. So, three well-known Prashustis of this period were the Hathigumpha inscription of Kharavela, Gautamiputra Balasri's Nasik Prashusti of her son Gautamishuputra Satakarni, and the Junagadh Prashusti of Rudradaman. They had completely different form and content, but there were certain shared traditions. Today we shall discuss the Junagadh inscription with you. Now, the objectives for this discussion are that we have to understand from this Prashusti the political aspect, the economic aspect of the time, and of course, the history of the Sudarshana lake, which is the main purport of the inscription, and we also gather information about the personal accomplishments of Rudradaman. This is the original location of the rock where the inscription was written, and interestingly, this inscription is written on this rock where we have also the Ashoka's major rock edicts and the Junagadh inscription of Skandagupta, but now it has been taken in a different place and kept protected. Rudradaman first was the son of Jayadaman and the grandson of Jashtana. In the early 2nd century CE, this line of Shaka rulers emerged in the western part of the Indian subcontinent and the dynastic name was Kardamaka. So, we had earlier the Shaharata dynasty, which the most important ruler of which was Nahapana. Now, for the Kardamaka dynasty, Jashtana was then very important ruler, and then Jashtana's son was Jivadaman and his son was Rudradaman, who also acclaimed himself to be a Mahakshatrapa. Rudradaman's kingdom actually, if we look at the locations of the places, we find that there are quite overlaps in the kingdom between Rudradaman's kingdom and the Satavahana territory, and this actually talks about contestation. The location of the inscription, as I already mentioned, that it was near a top in Junagadh in Gujarat, atop of a hill, and the script is Brahmi, and it is the first Prashusti in classical Sanskrit and which was written in prose. Earlier Prashustis were in Prakrit. The purpose of this inscription is to record the restoration of a Mauryan period dam on the Sudarshana lake by the Mahakshatrapa Rudradaman. This dam was still in use but badly breached by a violent storm. Actually, this inscription gives you the history of the Sudarshan lake, and this is one of the very important supralocal irrigation project that we had in India in the post-Mauryan period. The inscription gives us, as I mentioned, the history of the lake, and it records the restoration which took place during the time of Mahakshatrapa Rudradaman. It is said that in the inscription that it was constructed by Boishya Pushyagupta, who was the governor of Chandragupta Maurya. Later on, during the time of Ashoka, we have Yavanaraja Tushashva, who was perhaps an Iranian governor in this region, who decorated the inscription and you added by adding channels. So, we have this term Pranalibhir Alankritam. So, we have Boishya Pushyagupta during the time of Chandragupta Maurya, then we have Yavanaraja Tushashva as the governor of this region. During the reign of Rudradaman in the winter of the year 72 of the Shaka era, that is we can datable to 150 CE, there was a terrible storm. The storm tore a bridge of 420 cubits long and wide and 75 cubits deep into the lake's embankments. All its water flowed out and the lake resembled now a sandy desert. The Sudarshana lake, it is said in the inscription that which is the literal meaning of which is beautiful to look at, became Durdarshana, that is ugly to look at, because all the waters were coming out of the bridge and therefore it looked like a sandy desert. People were very sad and they lamented, they were crying because they needed this lake for their sustenance. So, Rudradaman wanted to repair the lake, but considering the huge damage that has happened, his ministers and councillors were not very agreeable and they did not think it viable that the bridge could be repaired. But he was bent upon doing that for the betterment of the people. Then there was one governor who was the governor of Anarta and Shurashtra, and his name was Subishaka. He was a Parthian, that is a Pahlava, and his father was Kulaipa. He agreed to actually work for the repairment of the lake. And so the lake was reinforced and made 3 times as strong in length and breadth on all sides in a very short time. Regarding the content of the inscription, we find that it gives you a whole lot of information, his contestations, his persona, his accomplishments, his military achievements. So, all are there, that is common to a Prashasti we find in this inscription. And it is very important that when Rudradaman talks about the repairment of this Junagadh lake, the embankment which was hugely costly, he says that the inhabitants of towns and villages were not oppressed by taxes, forced labor or any other impositions for repairing the dam. Forced labor is known as Vishti, other term is Koro, and other pranaya, that is the general tax. So, the required money was spent from his own treasury, Swasmat Kosha, which was full of diamonds, golds, lapis lazuli, beryls and other precious stones. So, the inscription tells us that Rudradaman had all this done in order to benefit cows and brahmanas for 1000 years and for the sake of righteousness, that is dharma, and kirti, that is fame. So, these are the objectives, that why a benevolent work was being done, because excavation of a tank, repairing of a tank, a water reservoir was always considered a benevolent work in Brahmanical normative text as well as also in Buddhist texts. The inscription also gives us an idea of the territorial expansion of Rudradaman's kingdom and of course about his military achievements. Therefore, as we read the content of the inscription, we find that he is described as the lord of Akara, Avanti, the Anupa country, Anarta, Shurashtra, Shabra, Maru, Kachcha, Sindhu, Shavira, Kukura, Aparanta, Nishada and other countries by dint of his own valor. And a careful look at some of the territories would show that these were a part of the Satavahana domain at one point of time. Rudradaman claims that he has defeated the Yodhyas who were arrogant, loathful and who were trying to defeat the Kshatriyas. It is also described as, he is also described as having defeated Shatakarni, lord of Dakshinapatha, twice in fair fight, but sparing his life only because he was a close relative. Rudradaman is described as one who was distinguished by royal fortune. Lakshmi was always in favor of him right from the time when he was in his mother's womb. He was chosen by all Varnas as the lord to protect them. I am narrating the content of the inscription and then we will come to the discussions. He had made a vow never to kill men except in battle. Rudradaman was also moved by compassion and reinstated deposed kings. So, we have this phrase Aneka Bhrashta Raja Pratisthapita. So, therefore, this was a common phenomenon which we also find in the Nasik Prashasti. So, there were a set of local chiefs who were actually who expressed their obedience to Rudradaman and he then reinstated them. He was very generous and the habit of bestowing gifts and honors on others and showed respect to others. These are narrated in the inscriptions. An important part of the inscription was the eulogy of the king, of course. So, his personal accomplishments were also discussed. It is said that he had earned wide fame by his knowledge and practice of grammar, music and logic and other great sciences. He was skilled in the horses, control of horses, elephants and chariots, in the use of sword and shield and in the face to face combat. So, because there is an ambience of contestation. So, we know of the famous Shaka-Satavahana rivalry. So, during Rudradaman's time, it was the third phase of that rivalry. Apart from the Satavahanas, there were other rulers, for we mentioned the Yodhyas and there must be some other rulers. So, there was always a feeling of there was competition and contestation. As a ruler, he obviously was very good looking. His body was marked by excellent marks and signs such as auspicious signs, length, dimension, height, voice, gait, the way he walked, his complexion, vigor and strength. It is said that there was a Swayamvara and all the princesses who had come for the Swayamvara felt like garlanding him. So, he was wreathed by many garlands at the Swayamvaras of many kings' daughters, which shows that he was a very coveted husband. Now, this is the content, a basic content of the inscription. Now, what do we gather from that? What is the historical importance? So, the foremost importance of this inscription is that it gives us the history of a reservoir or lake, which is very unique because we do not get certain kind of information normally in inscriptions during the time of the Mauryas, which has been completely devastated by a storm. So, as a result, we find that the repairs were commanded by Rudradaman. The dam was not only rebuilt, but made thrice as strong as before. The dam itself had been erected on a site possessing a natural embankment, a Kritima Setubandha, the term used is, and it was, so you have the technical descriptions also. It was also provided with conduits, drains and devices to take away foul matter. So, it was very well planned and well organized kind of dam. Rudradaman also established his power over Akara, Avanti, Anupa, Anarta, Shurashtra, Shwabra, Kachcha. We have discussed all this when we were reading the inscription, but as for the location of these places, Anarta was northern part of Kathiawar, Shurashtra is Kathiawar Peninsula, Shwabra on the banks of the Sabarmati, Kachcha is Kutch, Sindhu Shavira is the lower Indus Valley both to the east and the west of the Indus, Kukura, Aparanta and Noshada located somewhere between the Vindhya and the Paripatra mountains, and they were a part of the territories of the Satavahanas. If you look at this map is a map of the Satavahanas, but we have many of these locations which were under the, for example, Akara, Avanti, Anupa, these were part of the Satavahana domain, which Rudradaman claims to be a part of his kingdom. This shows the transition of the rule in this area from the Satavahanas to the Shakas. The struggle is between these two is also referred to in the inscription, as we mentioned that he says that he twice defeated Satakarni, the lord of the Deccan, but spared him on account of the nearness of relation. Now, it is said that Rudradaman's daughter was married to Satakarni. This Satakarni is the son of Gautamiputra, second son of Gautamiputra Satakarni, his name is Vasishtiputra Satakarni. And there is an inscription in Kanheri which talks about a ruler called Ru, and if this Ru is same as the Rudradaman, then this Satakarni was the son-in-law of Rudradaman, and therefore, because of the nearness of relation, even after defeating him, Rudradaman spared his life. So, he did not uproot the Shaka adversary. He also, we find that, conquered the Yodhyas. Now, the boast that we find after conquering the Yodhyas shows that he was very happy to get rid of these martial tribes. The Yodhyas, along with the other Ganashanghas in Malavas, Arjunayanas, they were actually they moved towards Rajasthan, were settled in Rajasthan, and and they were warring race. Panini calls the Yodhyas Ayudha Jivi Shangha. So, they sustained themselves on the basis of warfare. So, therefore, it might happen so that Rudradaman was wary of their presence nearby, and therefore, he was very happy to defeat the Yodhyas, and therefore, we have this boast in the inscription. They could be potential threat. In connection with the construction of the dam, huge amount of money, wealth was spent from his own treasury. So, it is stated in the epigraph that his treasury was overflowed with an accumulation of gold, silver, diamonds, beryl stones and other precious things. It seems that since he was in control of Akara, which was the mining place, Kosha, Ptolemy also talks about this region as Kosha. So, naturally the diamond mines were under his control. So, with this control of the diamond mines and other semi-precious stones and precious areas of precious stones, mining areas, it was natural that his treasury would be full of this kind of stones, precious elements. But what is important, that he maintains that that he obtained the taxes rightfully, that it is the normal law, and collection of taxes like Bali, that is a kind of tribute from the subjects, Shulka is a ferry dues, tolls duties on merchandise, and Bhaga, royal share, generally 1/6 of the produce, was normal and it has to be paid by the subject. And according to the same inscription, we find that he caused the rebuilding of the dam without oppressing the inhabitants of the towns and country. Paura Janapada, the terms are used by Koro, that is periodical text, Vishti is forced labor, and Pranaya, that is benevolence tax of non-recurring nature. Thus, we have two sets of tax in this period. So, one was the normal tax, Boli, Bhaga, which a subject had to pay, and the other was the extra tax, which generally the rulers used to impose upon as a part of the welfare activities. And Rudradaman very proudly proclaims that he did not impose this tax on the subjects. He paid them from his own treasury, Swasmat Kosha. Thus, we can easily understand that the prevalent taxes of the time were Boli, Shulka and Bhaga. That his treasury was overflowed with precious and semi-precious stones might suggest that royal dues were collected also by accepting different kinds of precious stones and metals. So, here we have two kinds of, one was the tax that was paid, other was tax which were paid in kind. So, we know that he had control of the diamond mines and other areas. So, these were there. Apart from that, it could so happen that some of these objects were also offered to him as a tax in kind, and we have similar example in Begram, where we find that during the Kusham period many things were given as tolls in the to the ruler in Begram region. So, this kind of given taxation in the kind is also quite prevalent, was quite prevalent in that area. That his treasury was overflowed, we have mentioned that this ideal of taxation of the period. Next very important point that the inscription tells us is the personal accomplishments of Rudradaman. It gives us all the qualifications that was required to be a ruler, Thus, it is said that he is well versed in grammar, music, logic and other great sciences. And apart from these intellectual pursuits, he was also equally trained for any kind of military endeavor worthy of a king. Therefore, he was adept in fighting in any kind of combats, following the common tradition of Prashastis. As I mentioned, that there were certain shared traditions, and always the Prashastis showed that the king were very good looking, they had a moon-like face and they had a very wonderful gait. So, his physical attributes have also been described in the inscription. He was handsome and was adorned with excellent marks in his body. The voice, gait, color, vigor, all this we have already discussed, that we have, these were there in him as a ruler. Therefore, there were many princesses of many countries who were eager to marry him. It is significantly suggested in the inscription that he acquired by his own merit, Swayamagata, the title of Mahashatrapa. So, the might and valor. So, perhaps he was just a Kshatrapa in the beginning, and then later on he became a Mahashatrapa. The inscription also talks about the idea of dharma, artha and kama, because these are the objects of piety, wealth and pleasure are duly attained by a ruler. And we know that these three categories of dharma, artha and kama were deemed by the Smriti texts to constitute the threefold goals of human activity, and with this, if we add moksha, then we have the ideal purushartha. The qualities of a minister is described also in the inscription, because when Rudradaman, the stage was such that Rudradaman was looking for somebody who would actually take charge of rebuilding the dam, then the choice fell on Subhishaka. Now, Subhishaka was a Pahlava, as I mentioned earlier, and what is interesting is to note that in the last phase of the inscription, his qualities are also precisely mentioned by the writer. It is said that his dealings with people were proper and had sane views in things temporal and spiritual, that he was a very balanced, he was a minister, amatya, so very balanced. And the minister had a record of good governance. He increased the spiritual merit, fame and glory of his master Rudradaman. Therefore, by good acts of the minister, the glory of the master was enhanced. In fine, what we see in the inscription, or what we read in the inscription, we can see that we have a history of the lake, though very briefly the previous history is mentioned, but still we know that this lake was excavated during the time of the Mauryas. Then coming to the present scenario of Rudradaman, the lake was still there, and then it gives you an idea of the storm by which the lake and the surrounding country was devastated. The description is beautiful and it shows that the writer was endowed with poetic power, though mainly the inscription is in prose. Next comes the king, who is central to this kind of prashastis, and therefore the focus of attention is the king, where his bodily splendor is described in a glorious manner. They also talk about that these kings wielded sovereignty over lesser rulers. The kings were compassionate, and these are the shared traditions that we find in 2-3 inscriptions of the time. The kings were compassionate, and we see the beginning of a stereotype where we refer to gifts of brahmanas and exemptions from taxes. We get an idea also of the kind of taxes that were being imposed in this period. The prashastis also reflect an idea of competition and contestation between the different rulers. We learned that Gautamiputra was described as the destroyer of Shakas, Yavanas and Pallavas and the extinguisher of the Khakarata line. In similar manner, Rudradaman's prashasti also talks about the defeat of Satakarni, that he twice defeated Satakarni. So, this kind of exaltation of a ruler was very common in that period. Taken together, these two prashastis, if we look at the Nasik prashasti of Gautamiputra Satakarni and the Junagadh inscription, we find that it makes interesting reading of the political scenario. So, the shared practices that are referred to came from a common tradition. Therefore, if we have to know the history of post-Mauryan India, the inscription of Rudradaman is extremely important for us, not only because of the history of the lake that we find from it, but also because of the fact that it talks about the manner in which the kings competed at that time, the manner in which the kings were projected in inscriptions, and how inscriptions themselves became avowedly political text. Thus, it is very important when we study an inscription, we can always study them not as separate pieces, but together also. And here is an example where we have the Hathigumpha inscription of Kharavela, which you will find in one of the modules. Then we have the Gautami Balasri's inscription, the Nasik Prashasti, and this Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman. So, if we combine these three inscriptions and read them together, we will find that there was a kind of a common tradition. As I mentioned earlier, that in the post-Gupta or in the early medieval phase, we have the classic format of a Prashasti, that how a Prashasti should be written. So, we have, like, it starts with a Siddham symbol, then we have the eulogy, and then all the other parts. But here we do not have. So, we have all the inscriptions are separately written. But there are certain things which has commonality. For example, the bodily splendor of a ruler. If we read Kharavela's Hathigumpha inscription, there too Kharavela is described, his bodily splendor is described. Rudradaman's bodily splendor is also described here. He is said to be very handsome with gait and nice. And we have Gautami Balasri's Nasik Prashasti, where Gautamiputra Satakarni is regarded as a person whose face is like a lotus flower, the way he walks like with the gait of an elephant. So, you have a beautiful picture of a king. So, kingship is something which is lauded, and then the kings are always very handsome. So, the persona of the king becomes important. Then secondly, some sharing of traditions, and there we find that the idea of a king who will impose, or he will try to establish the rulers, the circle of kings which has been deposed by the previous rulers. So, we have this term Aneka Bhrashta Raja Pratisthapita. So, each king who is important, who will have a circle of kings and will put those rulers into their places. So, that is a kind of an achievement, and that we find both in Gautami Balasri's inscription about Gautamiputra Satakarni and also about Rudradaman. Third important factor of this inscription is that the Shaka Shatavahana struggle. This is a struggle which is very important in Indian history. It has been studied in three phases. In the first place, we had another Shaka ruler belonging to another dynasty. Second phase was how Gautamiputra Satakarni defeated the Shakas, and in the third phase again we find that Rudradaman was fighting with the Satavahanas. So, the entire idea of contestations that came through. Another very interesting thing that we find here is that in the Nasik Prashasti, Gautamiputra Satakarni is lauded as Eka Brahmana and is said to have upheld the Varna Shankara, which means they do not allow intermarriages between different castes. Whereas, in case of Rudradaman, when we read this inscription, if the Satavahanas were very near in relation to Rudradaman, that shows that the idea of Varna Shankara was not prevailing here, because they were foreign rulers and the Shatavahanas were Brahmanas. So, there was a matrimonial alliance between the Satavahanas and the Shakas. So, what we have in the normative text, or what was written in the earlier Prashastis, the exigency of the time changed it. So, matrimonial alliance becomes very important in case of political contexts.